I'm focusing on worker cooperatives rather than cooperatives in general, not because I think other forms of cooperatives aren't also relevant. I think consumer cooperatives are certainly relevant. Credit cooperatives are relevant. But worker cooperatives, I think, are the more difficult case and also the more important one to expand. Now, a couple of observations. Worker cooperatives exist everywhere, but typically in very small units and in relatively marginal niches. Now, there are some exceptions. The most famous is Mondragon in northern Spain in the Basque Country. It's a large, high-tech industrial cooperative. It has, depending on exactly how you count the number of worker owners, somewhere between 45 and 60,000 worker owners. All owners are workers, but not all workers are owners. There are employees alongside workers, but it's overwhelmingly owned by the workers who work there. And it's very successful. In the Spanish economic crisis recently, of the 105 separate cooperative units, Mondragon is actually a kind of federation of cooperatives. Only one has had to be dissolved because of the crisis. And no worker owners have been laid off. They've been redistributed across other co-ops. It's fared much better than the rest of the Spanish economy. So we know that you can have big worker co-ops. But of course, the Mondragon case emerged under very special conditions. And in particular, a key condition for its development was the creation of a cooperative bank owned by the worker co-ops. And that was possible for historically specific reasons when Mondragon was founded during the Franco regime. Okay, so worker co-ops are an example. So the question then is, would it be possible to create conditions in capitalism for worker co-ops to thrive, to develop a sufficient density that they would create new institutions amongst themselves to create essentially a counter-hegemonic cooperative market economy? Still a market economy, co-ops produce and sell things, but it would be a cooperative market economy that would be operating in the same economic space as the capitalist market economy, but with different institutional infrastructure and different property relations. Is that possible? What would it take to do that? Well, here is where the articulation between symbiotic and interstitial transformations at least opens up a potential expansion. Symbiotic transformations take the form of asking the question, are there some problems within capitalist economies which can be solved more easily by expanding these interstitial possibilities than by restricting them? In many capitalist economies, this is certainly true in the United States. I imagine it's at least true to some extent in Ireland as well. A great deal of employment comes from small and medium enterprises. So while large corporations dominate the accumulation process, they don't dominate employment. Employment is much more in small and medium enterprises in the aggregate than in large corporations. I imagine that's true in Ireland as well, but certainly it's true in the United States. Many small and medium enterprises in the United States face what is called a succession crisis. That is, these are family firms, and the next generation doesn't want to take them over. It's a common problem, but it's a particularly acute problem in this decade and the next because the baby boom generation is aging out, and that's a fairly rich generation by historic standards, and they own a lot of small and medium businesses. Now that creates an economic space in which potentially the population of worker-owned firms could expand very rapidly. Because one solution to the succession problem is for owners to sell their firms to the workers. Now there's a problem. Workers can't buy the firms, and if they take out debt to buy the firms, they saddle the new firm with heavy debt load, which makes them no longer economically viable. So there's this problem that the worker buyout of even successful small and medium firms have, that the viability declines because of the conditions under which the buyout occurs. Now that's not a problem of viability because of competence of workers, because of lack of technical skill, because of any of the kind of purely technological or human aspects. It's just because of the problem of credit markets and how they work. But that's something that could be solved through appropriate symbiotic strategies. You could create special credit institutions precisely for the purpose of transitioning from a private family-owned firm model to a worker-owned cooperative model. And the logic of it could be, under conditions of globalization, one of the problems that economic development has in any capitalist country is how to root production more deeply geographically, how to anchor it in space. What better way to anchor a firm than to have the workers own it? By creating a stronger anchored sector, even within a capitalist logic, it makes for a healthier capitalist economy. So the reasoning here is that at this stage in the development of capitalism, a new equilibrium of capitalism with a large worker-owned cooperative sector combined with a corporate bad guy, globalized capital sector, that combination is actually better for capitalism. That's why it's a symbiotic strategy. But by executing that strategy, you're also building an alternative form inside of capitalism. It's a bit like, the analogy's stretched, but it's a bit like, saying if we can strengthen the merchant capitalists and the guilds, some feudal lord says, I'll be able to solve some problems of getting financing for my wars against my neighbor lord, whatever. It's just like capitalism served purposes for feudal elites, a worker-owned cooperative sector would serve purposes for capital. Now leftists tend to, when they see that, say, that must mean it's not a good thing. Kind of the standard reaction is, if it's good for capital, then there must be something wrong with it. We want to resist it. That's co-optation. This is an alternative that gets absorbed into capitalism. I think that's not the right way to think about it. Now I recognize that of course it's contradictory. That's the whole idea here. Capitalism is a contradictory system, but we should take advantages of those contradictions to build alternatives that, while solving problems, are nevertheless a thorn in the side. After all, fundamentally, that's what bourgeois democracy is, right? Before workers won the vote, what we call bourgeois democracy is a success of popular struggle. It wasn't a gift from conniving capitalists who saw a brilliant way of subduing the working class. It was the result of struggle. But it also helped stabilize capitalism. Bourgeois democracy has performed brilliantly as a shock absorber, as a way of managing crisis conditions and disruptions in a way that authoritarian capitalist states would have found way more difficult, would not have been as good for capitalism. And yet bourgeois democracy is a form of empowerment. It does create more space for struggle. It's much better to struggle for alternatives under liberal democratic conditions than under militarized authoritarian conditions. And that's why I think one should think of this as deeply contradictory rather than just co-optive. So if we can imagine a set of public policies that would underwrite the reproducibility and sustainability of worker-owned firms, at this particular point in history, I think that would trigger a very rapid expansion because of this succession problem of small and medium firms. And the new equilibrium, 25 years into the future, would then have a large cooperative market economy interpenetrated and intermingled with a capitalist economy. But that's a better platform to think of what subsequent transformations might be desirable. One other sort of policy point in this context is one of the reform proposals which I think potentially would have the most profound consequences for changing the terrain for subsequent transformation of capitalism, and that's unconditional basic income. Which I gather in Ireland there's some real discussion about basic income, at least in some niches emerging. So unconditional basic income is a very simple idea. It basically says let's scrap all the basic income security programs we have, get rid of them all, and replace them with a very simple program, which is everybody gets unconditionally a monthly income sufficient to live above the poverty line. So it's an unconditional basic income. The higher the level of the basic income, the more generous it is. Of course, the more radical it is, the more disruptive it is. Think of the highest possible sustainable level as what you would strive for. An unconditional basic income, I think, is compatible with capitalism. Capitalists don't want it. It's not optimal for capitalism, but it's compatible with capitalism. That is, a capitalist economy could survive and function well with an unconditional basic income. But it would be a capitalist economy with a very different kind of rhythm and dynamic. And above all, with respect to what we're just talking about here, imagine what an unconditional basic income does for the space of worker-owned cooperatives. Right, so worker-owned cooperatives face this very big problem that workers have to eat. It's one of these, glitches in the transformational aspirations. They have to eat, which means that if they're learning the process of cooperating and forming, an enterprise, even if it's a question of conversion from an already existing enterprise, they have to generate a sufficient stream of income right from the start, sufficient to reproduce themselves and their families, as well as sustain the firm. And that's a pretty big demand on a firm. It makes them appear to be high risk to banks. So one of the problems for worker-owned co-ops is they always find it difficult to get credit because they're viewed as high risk. I don't think the main problem with getting credit is that bankers are nasty, or that, they may also be nasty. I think if bankers felt this was a reasonable risk and that they'd get the loan paid back at the market interest rate, they would do it. I don't think that the hesitance of bankers to give loans to worker co-ops is that they're very skeptical that they'll be successful. Well, an unconditional basic income dramatically lowers the risk of lending to co-ops. Because bankers then also know the co-op does not have to provide for this basic subsistence level. That's guaranteed independently of the performance of the co-op. And that automatically makes co-ops more viable. So an unconditional basic income can be thought of as a way of creating an expanded space for the creation of counter-capitalist institutions like worker co-ops. Also another, while we're on giving my shtick on basic income, two other nice ramifications of an unconditional basic income. You could scrap all agricultural subsidies. When you have a basic income, the basic income becomes a subsidy for small farmers, but it becomes an increased cost for agribusiness. And the reason, whereas current agricultural subsidies mainly subsidize big farms, agribusiness, rather than small farmers, but the justification for agricultural subsidies is always small farmers. A basic income actually enables small farmers to survive, but makes it more costly for big farms, because agricultural labor becomes more expensive. If agricultural laborers have an exit option, in order to get them to work on the farm, they have to be paid more. They have an exit option with unconditional basic income. That is, they don't have to work at subsistence rates for farmers. They get that unconditionally. Agricultural labor becomes more expensive, but small farmers are reproduced. And also think of the performing arts, one of my favorite topics in this respect. The current way of subsidizing the performing arts is to have arts boards that accept proposals from artists, and they pass judgment on what's worthy and unworthy art. What's a worthy and unworthy dance company or theater company. With an unconditional basic income, you're directly providing basic subsistence to the performers, and then they collaborate to decide what art to produce. It becomes a massive but uncensored way of supporting culture and art. From the point of view of ecological sustainability, unconditional basic income makes it possible to much more easily shift from the high consumerism, high consumption lifestyles that come along with the necessity of participating in capitalist labor markets to at least a sector of the economy and of the population that engage in a low carbon footprint economy. Voluntary simplicity, it's sometimes referred to. So all these things are ramifications. Imagine if basic income creates the possibility of political coalitions of small farmers and poets. You know, it's a kind of fantasy of the left that freewheeling intellectuals and peasants can be a coalition, and a stable one because they are both underwritten by the same new equilibrium. Well, unconditional basic income is thought of correctly as a social justice issue, as a way of dealing with poverty, as a way of solving all sorts of problems that exist in capitalism, and being in many ways more efficient from a capitalist logic than the current patchwork system for solving these problems. But it also, and this is what I think is even more fundamental, it expands the space for these interstitial transformations from below. Okay, that's the basic scenario of my strategic argument here, and I think time just to throw this open for...
yeah, before we do that, can we have a 5-minute break? If people could be back in 5 minutes, anybody has something to do, now is the time to do it.
Well,
and then we'll engage then.
If people don't want to, but Roy just needs to sort out some. Yeah, do you want to have a break, Lan, do you think? Do people want to have a break? No. No? We won't have the break. I'll just sort out some with Roy then. Yeah, just continue on.
Okay. Okay, just a couple of ground rules of thing. If you have a question or a point to make, will you please just identify yourself? And if you can, if it's relevant, will you just, not everybody in this room will know everybody else, so if you can just say what your basic background is, if you have a party allegiance, if you're coming from an academic background, just to give us a bit of context of where the question might be coming from. One other ground rule, if we could avoid having lengthy sort of soapbox counter statements against what Erik is proposing. If you want to do that, keep it very short, and then we'll move on. So I'll be releasing it.
That's obviously.
Just that one little anecdote as a kickoff. I gave a talk with many of these elements at something called the New Utopia bookstore in Beijing, which I thought would be great because it had the word utopia in it. It turns out that it's a venue for unreconstructed Maoists. And the first question was a lengthy question which began by saying, and what has become of the road of blood and iron? Blood and fire, blood and fire. And so,
the first question is Michael?
That's right, yeah. Michael O'Brien, I'm a member of the Socialist Party. There's a lot I could say, but I'll stay off the soapbox. I mean, just the two brief points is that I really think your conclusions about revolution or the rupture strategy, that it seems to me that we have to kind of look at a few case studies. If you take the Arab Revolution at the moment, and I understand revolution both as a process and an event. If I understand you correctly, you say that a revolution, by definition, cannot be truly democratic unless it has some threshold of active participation by the majority of the population.
No, what I'm saying is a revolution that wants to smash the social structure. The Arab Spring is not revolutionary whatsoever in terms of changing social structure. They're not proposing anything about the fundamental transformation of the power relations, the underlying economic system. And that's what you can't do without a majority.
See, my understanding of revolution as a process as well as an event is that the process of people engaging in struggle demonstrates a revolutionary potential to me in terms of the self-activity of the working class, whatever about the ultimate outcome, and it's an unfinished process. That's where I'm coming from. Just the other two brief points is that you do not seem to take into account the role of the capitalist state. This idea that through a combination of worker-owned cooperatives that somehow over a long period of time, decades, that we could supplant the capitalist system, that I just, that the capitalist state acts to defend the interests of big business and to smash apart. And the last point really is that it's the role of the economy and the cycles of crisis within capitalism itself that, from the point of view of most working class people, the situation for elementary self-defence, when your pay conditions and public services are being attacked, the situation demands that they are to be defended and those attacks are to be staved off. That, again, there's a revolutionary potential implicit in that as well. In other words, if you buy into the demands of the system, you accept cuts. If you reject them, well, then you're coming into collision with the system. So there's objective forces driving this as well as just, as conscious choice and conscious intervention.
So let me say one thing which I 100% agree with you. Because the way you were using revolution here, revolutionary process, is really about confrontational struggle, which I think is absolutely essential. I don't think that symbiotic transformations occur because of benevolent gifts from above. When they occur through struggle and mobilization and confrontation, in which there are victories and defeats. So I'm not arguing for a smiley face, win-win, let's shake hands and make for a better world view of the process. The process involves mobilization, it involves protest, it involves occupation of the state capital of Wisconsin for 2.5 weeks. It involves all sorts of struggles. The question is whether the vision for what you're hoping to accomplish with those struggles is a rapid smashing of the power structure of the existing ruling class. And if that's the vision of how you think you're going to get to a democratic egalitarian alternative, I think it's an illusion. So it's about the nature of the process of transformation of fundamental structures of the society that's in play here, not about the forms of struggle itself, which I agree, it's a process. You confront, you resist, you defend. In some contexts, you advance in others. The question is, what do you hope to accomplish? Secondly, about the capitalist state. The capitalist state, I don't think, should be thought of as an integrated homogeneous totality without internal contradictions, in which it is not possible to accomplish real utopian reforms in certain historical circumstances. That is, the symbiotic strategies involve figuring out ways in which you solve problems for capitalism. The succession problem of small businesses, the unemployment problem, the chronic unemployment problem under a globalized economy, the implications of current technological changes for the stability of capitalism, which I haven't mentioned. All of these are problems that capitalism faces. Some of these can be solved in ways that expand the space for alternatives, and some can be solved in ways that don't. Now I just think there's multiple equilibria here, and that the capitalist state is consistent with striving for equilibria that are better for workers rather than equilibria that are worse. And I think that's the best we can do. So my argument then is the alternative that's proposed, which is that our goal should be somehow at some point we'll be able to actually seize power and smash ruling classes. That's an illusion. It's never been done successfully. Never. Never. It's never been done successfully to result in a democratic egalitarian alternative. We know how, it's much easier to smash things.
I'm afraid the historic evidence doesn't offer the proof of that.
We don't have an example of a democratic egalitarian alternative that's emerged out of...
What happened in 1917?
It did not produce a democratic egalitarian social order.
No, it was a revolution.
But not a democratic social outcome.
The dictatorship of the proletariat replaced the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie.
But it was not a democratic egalitarian dictatorship of the proletariat.
So your thesis is that we should have the sort of democracy that is in your head as an eternal utopian salvation for humanity.
No, my vision is that strategy doesn't work. It hasn't worked, and I can't see it working. And I could be wrong, because my commitment is to evidence an argument about the nature of the consequences of certain kinds of transformations. So it may be that a democratic egalitarian alternative to capitalism is impossible. That's one.
It is possible equally.
What?
And it may equally be possible.
Right, I'm saying one possible, if It could be that we are all wrong, that an emancipatory alternative could ever be brought about by human device. I don't believe that to be true, though, as I'm sure you don't either.
Well, I don't agree with you on the
Sorry, we have other speakers from the floor.
You should continue to point to the point of a result.
Sorry, Valerie, we have to...
No, take it in order.
If somebody is speaking, I think we should continue so that we have some process and some result. Other than that, we just have a lot of data going out and no result. And I think the purpose of this is...
We're going to run the forum and stand
I think what you're saying, I'm not disagreeing with what you say, but I think there are many people have contributions to make here, and many differences. And it's the difference that should be put together and looked at. It's not just one voice, many voices here. We should look at all voices.
But we'll get around them in order. The next one is Jerry Green.
Jerry Granger from the Workers' Party. First of all, I want to welcome you here. I think it's an opportunity for us to engage in a debate, and there is a debate to take place. We are in the middle of a crisis, a systemic crisis of capitalism, but we need to have discussions as to the way forward. My own particular position of the party is that our predisposition is perhaps more towards the ruptural strategy than towards the interstitial or symbiotic strategy. That said, we take the purest position that we don't engage in democratic struggle. There are rights to be won for workers through democratic struggle, popular struggle. That said, I think historically, when one looks at capitalist mode of production, certainly everything that I have come to believe in, is that that is based on a mutually antagonistic and a mutually irreconcilable conflict of interests between capitalist class and the working class. That doesn't mean to say that from time to time it may not be in the interests of the capitalist class to exceed reforms which are for the benefit of workers. Of course, that's right. Anything else would be dogmatic and simplistic. The problem is, as I said, and this is a question rather than a statement as such, the problem that I have, and I don't in any way have any difficulty with workers' cooperatives or as I say, this general struggle for democratization. But the difficulty could be that if one sets aside, and I appreciate you do not rule out an interplay between ruptural strategies from time to time with the interstitial and symbiotic strategies. But if one does not have, my concern is that one does not have at the end of one's view in mind an ambition which is to transform capitalism, which we all agree on. But in my view, it can only be transformed by the removal of the exploiting class. And my fear is that when one looks at social democracy, the experience of social democracy, and even the current experiences of radical social democracy within, for example, France and Greece currently, that the problem is that